hearing room. A member of the inquiry team will inform you when to stand. Please remain at your seats until the chair and witnesses have left the room. Thank you for your attention. The hearing will start in a few moments.
Good morning, my lord.
Good morning, Miss Stewart. Now, you have a witness for us this morning.
I do indeed. Our first witness today, my lord, is from the Chief Executive Officer of the Scottish Tourism Alliance.
Very good. Now, good morning.
Good morning, Lord.
Right, Miss Stewart will have some questions for you, so if I can ask her to proceed.
Obliged. Could you please confirm your full name?
Yes, my name is Mark Crothall, and I'm the Chief Executive of the Scottish Tourism Alliance.
Thank you very much. And you have responded to a Rule 8 request from the inquiry providing information and documents, is that correct?
That's correct.
And for the benefit of the transcript, that Rule 8 response is to be found at SCI-STA000-402_0001. And in addition to the Rule 8 response, you have, as you say, provided a number of documents alongside that. The information from these documents, as well as the Rule 8, has informed my questions today. But if there's anything I don't ask you about, please be assured that it will be taken into consideration by the inquiry. Before I start asking you questions about your Rule 8 response, I'm reminded to remind you that we have stenographers taking a note of all that is said today, and for you to try, you and me with you, to try and speak slowly so they can transcribe accurately what's being said. You've mentioned that you are the CEO of the Scottish Tourism Alliance, the STA. How long have you held that role for?
I've held the role now since its inception, which is coming up for 13 years in May next year, so 12 and a half years.
And what role did you have before that?
I spent 35 years working in the hospitality and leisure industry. My prior role just before starting was managing the David Lloyd Leisure Clubs across Scotland for 6 years, but before that hotels in Scotland and various other outlets and things across Glasgow and parts of the industry in the event sector as well, so from racecourses to golf clubs, etc. But a wide range of experience through those 31 years or 35 years, from restaurants in smaller rural parts on islands as well, but then large corporate chains. So my career experience is very broad, and I guess I have a very good understanding and appreciation of some of the challenges and the types of modus operandi the different parts of the sector have to go through on a day-to-day basis.
Thank you. Can you tell us a bit about what your role as CEO involves in general terms, and in particular what it involved during the pandemic period?
So during the pandemic, primarily the Scottish Tourism Alliance is the overarching umbrella body for the tourism and hospitality sector. And I say tourism and hospitality with a very broad church of definition, because we say tourism is everyone's business. We're a member organisation, purely self-funding, independent of government, apolitical as well. But what we do, we're able to, through our structure of membership, is gather together around 75% of the industry itself, but many of them being represented through the subsector trade bodies for the different divisions within the industry. So whether it's the self-catering community, to the tour operator community, licensed trade associations, hospitality, Sales Scotland, Wild Scotland, Confederation of Passenger Transport, many of those who I know you've taken evidence from as well. But our core role is being that, I guess, pivotal point which allows government to have direct interface, and we can gather together really, timely evidence, the hard facts, the pulse of the sector, what things are like. So through COVID, in particular, through this process, we were very much the convening body of the industry through our council forum and our destination forum as well. That was hugely important to allow me then to represent those, views of industry and the real harsh realities of what life was like on the ground. Or not, as the case may be, to the other organisations or the other roundtables that I was participating in, which was namely the business organisation and the sort of the COVID group that was gathered together alongside some of the other membership bodies such as the Scotland Food and Drink, the Retail Consortium, Scottish Financial Enterprise. But the day-to-day, I feel if ever an association was going to come into its own, it is always there in the form of a crisis or where there is a real challenge. And, personally, I took that as being a key responsibility of mine as the leader of the organisation to do that.
Okay, I'm going to come on to ask you about some of these groups and advisory bodies that you are part of. But you've mentioned that you represent about 75% of the industry. Can you tell us a bit more about the composition of STA's membership?
Sure. Well, we're structured into a sort of three-tier model of what we classify as alliance members. So they are all membership organisations of those subsector bodies, as I was referring to earlier. And they, of course, have their own extended members as well. And within that sort of destination forum group, there are roughly around 28, 30 DMOs, so management organisations who, not sectoral, but very much have a member community as well. So that's a big part of our member audience. Then we have our affiliate members who are direct-facing tourism businesses, tourism and hospitality businesses, and they would range anything from Edinburgh Airport to Mrs. Cameron's small B&B up in Wick if she wished to join the organisation directly. And then the third category of members are our associate members, and they range primarily supply chain, but we also have 14 to 15 universities, colleges as members, even some local authorities. So again, this very broad church. Plus, on top of that, another layer of patronage or patron members. So Royal Bank of Scotland, Diageo, Arnold Clark, who all have a vested interest in the sector and obviously are happy to support us given the role that we play.
Thank you. In terms of the governance structure of your organisation, can you describe that for us in general terms?
Yeah, we have a board, a governing board, which is made up of, at the time of the pandemic, I think 12 in number, with a chair, Stephen Leckie, who at the time was our chair. He's now moved on. He's now chair of Visit Scotland. Our board is very diverse in its makeup, so really to look at the different touch points of the industry. The director of the Scottish Retail Consortium, David Lonsdale, to the then director or chief executive of Scotland Food and Drink, James Withers, representation from the Glasgow Chamber of Commerce, colleagues in the south of Scotland, in the far north, in the Highlands, each with different sort of skill sets. So they are the governing board, however, contributed a lot into the conversations around the tables that were had. We then have our industry council, and it's our council group that were, I guess, the primary respondents and that were convened, and that's the roughly the 30-odd trade bodies I was referring to earlier. And then the third tier is the destination forum. So that gathering that community of organisations together in the way that we did and do come together is key. We have subsequently, post-COVID, a dedicated policy group as well, which sort of develops our manifestos for government and any sort of any responses we might choose to make to government or other organisations.
In terms of the aims of the organisation, you've already touched on that, but I'm mindful that it also includes hospitality as well as tourism. Can you expand on your role in connection with hospitality?
Well, we actually, as an umbrella organisation, have the greatest number of hospitality members under the umbrella of the sector, primarily due to we have all of the hotels associations across the cities as members, and many of the larger properties as direct members. But UK Hospitality Scotland, being the main sort of UK body, sit on our council, so their extended membership obviously feeds into us, as do the Scottish Licensed Trade Association, the Beer and Pub Association, and then of course beyond that you've got the Scottish Bed and Breakfast Association and the wider Hostelling Scotland. So the classification of hospitality in the broader sense is very definitely sort of sits around our membership. Tourism, visitor attractions and travel trade, etc., of course are there too, and you know, we work together as one unit, and the industry leadership group for the sector is actually referred to as the Tourism and Hospitality Industry Leadership Group since it's reformed, rather than it being tourism only.
Thank you. In terms of the nature and extent of the relationship between STA and the Scottish Government pre-pandemic, you've set out the groups you were part of during the pandemic. Can you explain to us what the nature and extent of that relationship was pre-pandemic?
Well, throughout, our core role and purpose as an organisation has always been to represent and basically lobby government in trying to ensure that the best conditions for success for the industry to thrive and prosper are laid out, and we were initially formed off the back of an invitation by Scottish Government and the enterprise agencies to develop and lead the Scotland's national tourism strategy. So the relationship of working with ministers, specifically Fergus Ewing at the time, who was our tourism minister for much of the period of my time since starting out. Fiona Hislop, I think, had a brief role within the portfolio. Has always been very good. It's been very open. It's been very transparent. We met regularly. The First Minister, Nicola Sturgeon at the time, committed to meet with our board 2 or 3 times over the 2-3 years leading up to it. They were regular contributors to our conferences, but it wasn't just the Scottish Government ministers. We have a complete open dialogue with opposition party MSPs as well as UK government as well.
Thank you. And did that communication with the government take place in any formal advisory group, or was it more of a flow of information as and when needed?
No, there was a group that was established through the COVID period, which were the 9 business organisations, which Kate Forbes at the time was the chair of that particular group, and that brought together not just the business organisations but also some of the medical civil professionals, the civil servants. I think Linda Bold, for example, used to contribute into that, and others. So we convened, or that group was convened I think at the outset on almost 2, 4, 5 times a week, and then as sort of the pandemic sort of thankfully petered away, the frequency was less. But it was very focused around the sort of COVID response and the COVID issues. The same group now still convenes, but looking more about the economic environment. So, and you'd be familiar possibly with the New Deal for Business group, for example, which was recently brought about by the First Minister Humza Yousaf. So it's the same organisations, but our focus and remit was very much around COVID.
Thank you very much. I'm going to come on to ask you some more about these groups that existed during the pandemic response period. I want to ask you first of all about Scotland's national tourism strategy. You mentioned that in your Rule 8 response. What is this strategy?
Well, we were just coming to the end of the national tourism strategy for Scotland, which is again, it's not the Scottish Tourism Alliance strategy; it's the industry's strategy, and everybody was signed up to it. Tourism Scotland 2020 was the strategy that we were all working to, and obviously 2020 being the year where there needed to be a strategy beyond it. So over the course of back end of 2018 going into 19, there was a steering group established to develop what is now and still current our national tourism strategy through to 2030, which is Scotland Outlook 2030. And the launch of that strategy was at our national conference on the 5th of March in Glasgow.
Thank you. And you mentioned everybody signed up to it. Who is involved in drafting this strategy?
So the process of the strategy development involved a range of engagements and workshops that took place across the country over a period of about 12 to 18 months. Obviously, there was a steering group which I co-chaired, where I chaired actually with a number of business colleagues, but also representatives from the government and the agencies. It was developed in a much more collaborative way and fully, so as an ownership. So there were about, from recollection, about 3,500 businesses that contributed into the shaping and the development of the strategy that still remains current today.
Thank you. And in terms of STA's involvement in developing that in particular, was there a particular role, or were you just one of many organisations contributing to that?
So the way we had a colleague, Karen Christie, who her role was funded by Scottish Government, and Karen sat within our organisation to undertake the project management and coordination of the strategy, so a dedicated strategy coordinator. Our role is as much about the engagement and getting others around it. So it was, very much treated as a collaborative approach, and ultimately we all work to the same aim. So being the organisation through our lobby efforts to influence the right conditions for success for the strategy to come about, it all sort of weaves one into the other.
Thank you. And you mentioned this was launched on the 5th of March 2020, so just before the lockdown and restriction measures were announced. Was any aspect of that strategy implemented, or?
Unfortunately not. The timing was obviously, well, I say unfortunately not. I'll be corrected on that. Yes, the strategy launched. It has four or five key priorities around business, place, people, and experience, looking very much through the lens of sustainability. It was launched on, as I say, on the 5th of March, and throughout the COVID period, we did a sense check of the strategy and its relevance during that time to see if it would still be fit for purpose. And actually, through the COVID years, there was a group that was established to identify where there might be some opportunities to deliver against some of the actions, so particularly around the people agenda and also technology. We thought at the time of launch getting more businesses connected and engaged with technology and using technology would be probably one of the bigger challenges, but the results of COVID, of course, saw, pretty much everybody in Scotland soon getting online and having to live a different way. So there were parts of it that were pushed forward, but not as much as we would have liked to. It was only since 2023 when we've regrouped that's now started.
Okay, I want to take you now to the role of STA during the pandemic and ask you something of the various groups that you've mentioned a short while ago. But I note in your Rule 8 response that you say immediately the STA took on an enhanced and more proactive engagement role. Could you expand on that, please?
Well, typically, we would only convene our council formally 4 to 5 times a year. We also, our communications to the industry would normally, pre-COVID, have been once or twice a month in a sort of formal way of news updates. And obviously our role and interactions with government were, again, constrained by government diaries and availability. So our role, we saw it very much about, needing to ensure that there was a much more frequent engagement and coming together. So as I referred to earlier, the council gatherings were almost daily. Our communications out to industry were daily and in a language which was felt to be, in our view, simple, easily understood, providing reassurance, signposting to where businesses could access any additional support that was announced. but also I was wanting to make sure that, you know, officials and ministers and others were obviously informed as well. And my attendance and our attendance and representation at these meetings, and also STIRG, which is another group that was established, which the Scottish Tourism Emergency Response Group, which was a forum of Visit Scotland, the enterprise agencies, Business Gateway, Skills Development Scotland and Scottish Government. That was the sort of catalyst group, I suppose, for the sector, and obviously feeding into that forum on a regular basis, daily basis as well, was important and has been still.
I wanted to ask you about that STIRG, that group you've just referred to there. When was that group established?
It was pretty much established at the outset of COVID. STIRG is a concept or a model that was actually put into play when we had the foot and mouth challenges, and you know, I guess it was a tried and tested model. The Scottish Tourism Alliance didn't exist at that time, so we were an additional voice into that forum. And of course, you know, through Visit Scotland and all of the others, the enterprise agencies having, you know, obviously strong interests in tourism as well, it was felt that if you had this inner group, it was another means to be able to, I suppose, take some sort of take responsibility for certain actions, but also ensuring that we could try and reach out to a wider audience, because certainly not everybody sits under the umbrella of the STA nor connects with us. Likewise, they don't Visit Scotland or the others. So, but that core group of 5 or 6 allowed for us to interact with other organisations through local authority networks as well. So it was, I think, personally, a very well balanced group. Lots of people wanted to be part of STIRG because they thought that's where all the decision making was going to be made, but it was too many people would have made it inefficient, and I think there was a respect by the industry as a whole that STIRG worked. But where there was very specific sectoral issues that I felt from an STA point of view would be better represented by individuals to STIRG or to ministers, then obviously we didn't get in the way of that. We allowed that to happen, and it was welcomed by government.
Thank you. And I think you mentioned daily meetings. Did STIRG meet daily?
From recollection, it felt daily. It almost sometimes felt hourly. You know, there was we were as fluid as could be. We had a lot of communications, obviously online. There was no closed door. I think transparency was absolutely critical and recognised as being important to everybody. Clearly, not everybody all the time would be available for those meetings due to other, issues they were dealing with. Not saying that COVID wasn't the biggest one, but it was all probably COVID related. But I guess it's a bit of a demonstration, really, of where the relationship sat of our ways of working pre COVID with the development of the strategy. It involved most of those characters and organisations in that conversation anyway.
Thank you. In terms of the establishment of this group, was that done at the request of the government or the industry?
From recollection, it was a recommendation from the Chief Executive of Visit Scotland at the time that be brought about, and again, having the concept having been worked well in a previous crisis, it was felt to be the best approach. So the then Chief Executive Officer of Visit Scotland instructed his colleagues to bring that together, and we convened in Ocean Point in their offices, and obviously invited, you know, there was a cast of many at the time, but the upshot of that was to say, okay, well, let's bring this into this very focused forum and actually then work through that agenda and work through those individuals to make sure that, you know, the industry could feel as reassured as possible, but also, you know, the other partners or the other key agents that actually make tourism happen, and that's transport companies and, for example, you know, who are a critical part of our delivery in terms of the supply chain, all had a voice in, or we were able to connect into them through different government agencies.
Thank you. And you've mentioned already the organisations who formed part of STIRG. You mentioned Visit Scotland. Was that list you gave an exhaustive list?
No, it was seven. I think it was 7 agencies, or 7 people in total. But Visit Scotland took the chair of STIRG, so it was chaired by the director of partnerships at the time, who has since retired. So Riddle Graham, and then but the other partners were the tourism leads from within the representative enterprise agencies and Skills Development Scotland.
Thank you. And in terms of your role sitting on that group, could it be described as coordinating the industry input, or how could it be best described?
Yes, bringing in obviously the feedback from the industry and making sure that there was a register kept of issues. So we logged pretty much everything that had been captured through the feedback given by colleagues around our council tables. But as you would expect and probably appreciate, I was having a lot of other calls coming from colleagues in the industry directly to myself, many of whom are friends and you got to know very well over the years. So being that sounding board, shoulder to cry on, and allowing for them to offload, but also, I suppose, make much, give me some really clear sort of understanding of certain specific impacts affecting their business that may not necessarily have been captured through some of the roundtable council discussions. That was able to bring that into the STIRG discussions as well and log on the register.
Thank you. Page 8 of your Relate response sets out some or perhaps all of the advisory groups that STA was part of, and if you could have that on screen, please. I want to just check that that is a complete list of the ones that you were part of. There's the STA Council, the Destination Forum, which you've mentioned.
I'm just trying to move this up. Sticky finger here. It's not, my screen's not moving here. I don't know if somebody can. Is it possible for someone to move this up, or does it do it? There we go.
Is it not moving for you?
It's not moving very fast, but if you want to read them out to me, then I can.
I can, of course. Just bear with me. There is the first one that's mentioned there is STIRG, which we've gone through. The second one is the National Strategy Coordinator, sat on the Scottish Tourism Emergency Response Group, STIRG, and the Tourism and Hospitality Recovery Task Force.
Yes.
And the next one is that you chaired and convened regular STA Council and Destination Forum member meets at which government officials were present.
Correct. So the task force that is referred to there is Fergus Ewing convened a task force of a slightly broader group of individuals that were brought together to identify what perhaps we could do from within the national strategy agenda. What could we do to get some activity and action undertaken to help with recovery, but most importantly, maybe protect some of particularly the workforce, as I referred to earlier. So Fergus Ewing convened that group, and I was asked to, basically in my capacity as the chair of the strategy steering group, to lead some of those conversations. But from recollection, the group makeup again had some a wide range of business owners and operators from around the country. It wasn't just that inner group or the original steering group of the strategy, but it was convened 3 or 4 times. Also, it had 3 union representatives on the group too. Very important that their voice was gathered. So ultimately, the recommendations from that group were presented to the First Minister, and there was some funding made available for various bits of activity to take place, which helped with the response, but also reposition the sector in its early part, so it was at least fit for opening to a point, particularly around infrastructure. The main thing, if you recollect, of course, when there was that first movement, there was a lot of exodus from the urban areas into the rural parts of Scotland, and the pressure on the infrastructure in those areas was very severe. So the infrastructure funds that were from that funding, there was monies that were made available to try and address some of those challenges.
Thank you. The other ones that are mentioned here is the COVID Business Organisations Group. Yeah. And the tour operator group.
Yes, the COVID Business Organisation Group is the one that I was referring to earlier, which was chaired by Kate Forbes, and that had the colleagues from Scottish Financial Enterprise, FSB, CBI, Scottish Chambers of Commerce, Scotland Food and Drink, Scottish Retail Consortium. I think we're 9 business organisations, and then the various civil servants from the different departments of the health departments as well. The latter one. If you can just repeat.
The tour operator.
The tour operator group, yes. So through the towards as a sort of a break, an offshoot of the Sturg group. It wasn't not an offshoot of the Sturg group. As a side, there are a number of tour operators that sit within our council group. So UK Inbound, the Scottish Independent Tour Operators Association, to the Scottish Destination Managers Association. This was these are obviously inbound tour operators who had a number of their clients already booked and contracted to come into Scotland over the course of the sort of months ahead. Many of them, of course, well, nearly all of them, because international travel was effectively stopped, were a group who were not only essential to Scotland's recovery and that longer term sort of market activity, but also extremely exposed to obviously funding, because much of their client base hadn't arrived or they hadn't been paid for. So this particular group was established to really make a strong case to the government that you have to plan for the future, and we need to make sure that the right organisations, or those organisations, are still able and fit to be able to go out and have a presence in other parts of the globe. Obviously it would be online, but primarily be there for when the restrictions were lifted and we could start to get back to some form of normal travel. And many of them are those businesses that bring the clients to the hotels, so they would contract hotel space, etc. So a key part of the supply chain.
Thank you. And perhaps something you might want to come back to us with later, but is that a full list provided in your Rule 8 response of the groups you were part of?
I sit on a couple of other boards through the skills group, and they were, which I still do. I'll come back to you if there's anything else that stands out, but in the main, the industry leadership group sort of touches most of those other groups as well.
Thank you very much. And you've mentioned that part of your role in these groups was seeking to advocate for the industry and inform the government. How did STA go about finding out from its members what the impacts were of the pandemic?
Well, as I say, using our forums as primarily the means to get that evidence in, and I would have to say I could only but applaud my colleagues who were on those forums. It became a way of life for us, I suppose, not something that we would want to go back to, but certainly the ability to go out and reach to our members, where Scotland is a small country and we're a very friendly sector. We all get on with each other, and being able to have access through those channels. And the Scottish Tourism Alliance was very much developed in the way it has been to allow this medium of gathering information rather than, and it's been welcomed by government from the outset, rather than having a multitude of different organisations to try and speak with. We were able to provide that source. I think at time of my coming into post and setting, I think there were 348 tourism bodies in Scotland, everything from sort of 1 or 2 individual people to large organisations. So being able to consolidate as we had was good. But those colleagues, and I know my colleague Fiona Campbell's up, being able she was very active in soliciting the insights from her member group, as were colleagues from ASVA, and it became again a best practice approach for us, and that all then funneled into our council meetings, and then obviously we were able to feed that back up into Sturg and those other forums that I was sitting at.
Thank you. Attending these meetings with Scottish Government officials, did you get a sense of how well understood or how poorly understood the tourism and hospitality industries were? I think it's mixed, to be fair, and I would just also like to sort of say the
the Scottish Chambers of Commerce, FSB, to Prosper as it now is. I mean, many of those organisations also have many of our members as members of their organisations too. So our tourism voice and tourism and hospitality voice was probably amplified through those forums when we convened. But to your question around do they understand tourism, we would have a lot of our audience still say that many don't. They think tourism just happens. So they certainly, I think many are not fully appreciative of the economics of a tourism business, how it functions, tourism and hospitality business, what that balance sheet looks like, the margins, how the construct of the business is, what's required in terms of making it fit for purpose, competitive, all of the other mechanics. And we're an industry that often gets looked at through a lens by many households of being one that tourism and hospitality is about being a bartender or a hotel manager. We have digital marketeers, we have engineers, we have all sorts of different skill sets that sit within our makeup, and very reliant on everything working together in a unified way. But critical to our industry is the supply chain too. So we can't function without that. So there has to be a much more joined up approach. And I don't think that was fully appreciated and understood by a good number of civil servants and others who, at the time when tourism stopped, suddenly probably got a bit more familiar and aware of just how impacting it was. Even in every household, you've got plumbers and florists and carpenters, etc., who are all very reliant on a tourism sector being thriving and operating.
Thank you. At the foot of page 7, and we can put this up on screen for you, you say that despite the representation back by ministers to colleagues and officials, it felt at times that despite the evidence provided, due to the nature of the sector and the way it operated, it was seen by some as a no-go or high-risk area.
Yes, I mean, obviously, when you come together in many of our spaces, it's a gathering of people. Restaurants, pubs, bars, events, festivals. We are a sector that, clearly gave concern, the nighttime industry as well, obviously, extremely concerned because of that sort of interaction. And when you were talking around social distancing and everything else that was in play, I think it was, taken as a sort of no-go area for that very basis. There was maybe not a fully appreciative understanding of you could still have a holiday, you could still go away. With a lot of our activity is outdoors, and people could go into certain types of properties and be contained and in their actual clusters and their groups that were formed. But often at times, when it came to decision making, we probably felt that we were an industry that was best left. Let's not open this sector because it's too high risk, and for that reason, the stop-start, flip-flop of open-close, etc., became something that was extremely frustrating and costly, despite the fact that the industry was doing every bit it could possibly to make sure it traded. Obviously, there were some of our businesses that supported the key worker community as well. Hotels went into key worker mode and made sure that there was a support network for those key workers as well. So it was not every individual, but at the same time, I think we weren't seen to be a sector of assured opening and allowing it for the freedom to trade as we all wanted it to. And we were coming out of a time where the industry had been dark, and I refer that to being closed for a period of 4 to 5 months over the winter season. And the majority of that industry, or those businesses, for the majority, would have actually exhausted all of their financial reserves, and therefore, needing to trade to stay alive, I think was actually, becoming all the more critical. From an analysis report, and I can't remember who actually did it, but I think there was some work that showed we had about 23 days of financial liquidity in the industry as a whole. So the knife edge of being able to actually stay functional in some form or another was really, hard.
I'm going to come on to ask you about those impacts, in particular the costs and the financial support. But just sticking just for a moment with this high risk, this perception of it being high risk and perhaps no go, are we to take from what you've said there that you think this view was ill informed and not justified?
You have to go by the science, and obviously we respected that, and I think our industry have always been respectful of, what is evidenced, etc. We would stand by, but I do think there were at times there was maybe a lack of understanding and a lack of awareness of what those options might be. That not all the sector was a high risk area. There were parts of it, yes. Potentially, but equally there were areas and parts of the sector that could, we believe, to trade and certainly provide a safe environment for visitors to go to. And the investment that was made by businesses into ensuring that sort of safety aspect was significant, because nobody would have wanted the wrong outcome. And not to be seen to be safe reputationally as much as that long-term protection of client base.
Thank you, that's very helpful, thank you. I want to take you back to the launch of the National Tourism Strategy on the 5th of March, and this was, as we've said, before lockdown, but it wasn't very long before it, as you've set out. How soon after this period was there an impact on businesses, on your members?
Well, it was literally the evening of our conference was a 2-day event. We had about 600 delegates convene in the exhibition centre. I had international speakers who all attended from Germany, Iceland, the Faroe Islands, Sweden, France. In fact, the only speaker that we had who was unable to attend was from Watford. Who actually was the managing director of the Harry Potter experience, which is owned by Warner Brothers, and they'd grounded all of their senior executive team from travel. But all our delegates arrived. It was a 2-day conference, and it was the evening of the day one. We had an event in the Radisson Hotel, Radisson Red Sky Bar, and one of my board directors was the chief executive of Edinburgh Airport, and he said to me that evening, I'm not going to be able to stay tomorrow. It's almost as if the world's fallen out of the sky, or is about to fall out of the sky. And immediately a couple of other colleagues as well who have businesses that are heavily reliant on international traveller base. Rabi's Tour being one. The owner was also there as a member, and they were literally seeing their bookings cancel in front of them, to the point that it was an absolute crisis. Clearly things were moving at pace. It didn't necessarily filter through to all those other businesses directly. I think there wasn't a full appreciation of the awareness of how severe things were and what was coming down the track very, very quickly. And our domestic tourism scene has always been very buoyant, but it was that night of the 5th that it became a very apparent to the fact that we have something which is about to impact us. And of course we'd all seen what was going on in Italy and everywhere else around the world in the weeks leading up to that, but I don't think anybody appreciated the likely severity of impact in Scotland so soon after.
Thank you. And in terms of you've mentioned there just in passing the 23 days of liquidity, how quickly did a lack of cash flow affect STA's members?
Well, the cash flow for us as an organisation, the bulk of our member renewal actually is in the month of March and April, and obviously when there was lockdown came in and that uncertainty of trade and clearly a loss of business for many, understandably so, those businesses would have to protect that was close to home, not discounting the fact that they still valued the role that the STA would play for them. So we were as exposed as much as anybody else when it came to risk, in terms of financial risk. And it was apparent, almost imminently. And as I said earlier, because so much of the industry is closed for a long period of the winter months, those bank balances were at rock bottom. Many of them would actually have committed investment over the winter months to refurbishment and things and spent that money, so and be ready to go in, hopefully, which would have been a busy Easter. And we'd come out of a 29 period where, you know, tourism was riding high in Scotland. We've been very fortunate to have had some significant growth, and all of our strategy at the time had actually delivered on its expectations. Scotland is a high demand destination and still is, so, you know, there was a lot of confidence, but that was just completely, you know, removed when it came to the impacts we felt in March.
Thank you. I want to ask you a bit about the differential impacts across the subsectors, and you've mentioned there the domestic market had been buoyant. In terms of the ones that were impacted the most, was it the international market, the domestic market?
Well, the international piece was, I think, in the first instance, an international visitor spends an awful lot more money than a domestic visitor, and they stay a bit longer. So that was the first evidence of impact. And I guess from also seeing, well, I don't guess, but seeing what else was happening elsewhere, we thought that, you know, the domestic market would, in some way, would be able to still happen. But our international visitors, because of the grounding of pretty much all air traffic, that was a lost scene. So there are certain types of businesses that are heavily reliant on that international footfall. Golf tourism, in particular, the golf market was, you know, very heavily focused into, you know, American visitors in particular, who would come. Our city centres, when it comes to, you know, as you've seen in Edinburgh here today, you know, there are lots of international visitors that, you know, really keep the city ticking over. I think at the time about 50% of the total tourism wealth generation actually happened in Edinburgh, you know, and but if you were in the rural parts and you had different types of properties depending on who they were, it was a lot of domestic travel, both that, and I say domestic in the sense of Scots exploring Scotland, and also UK from the rest of the UK coming up to Scotland as well.
Thank you. And you've mentioned already the impact on seasonal businesses who would have been closed over the winter, so I won't ask you to elaborate on that any further. I wanted to ask you about impacts on your members in terms of their workforce. First of all, in terms of staff retention, or perhaps even staff recruitment, thinking about those seasonal businesses.
Yes, it was a challenge for many, obviously, again, because of the balance sheet. We had obviously businesses who retained a workforce of a reasonable scale in the city, but again, the uncertainty of knowing whether there would be any support. Furlough hadn't been obviously announced at the time. Some businesses chose to quite quickly respond and take the measures they needed to, and staff were let go. We had roughly 28,000 Europeans working in the industry at the time. The majority of those returned back to their home origin. But coming back to the seasonality piece, a lot of the businesses also were just in the process of recruiting their staff for the season ahead. And given the timelines, many of them would have been contracted probably to have started around that sort of mid-March time, if not just before. And when furlough was obviously, thankfully, made available to businesses, the criteria for furlough at the time didn't basically benefit those who you had to have been in employment for, I can't remember, for at least 6 months of continued employment to be able to qualify for furlough. So there were staff who were contracted in good faith, had to be let go because there was no furlough to support them, and then that also then put an extra challenge and pressure onto the business operator, because as and when the time would come for them being able to reopen, you were trying to recruit at a time where potentially the workforce just wasn't available. And separate to that, there was also this position around how the industry was being positioned in terms of the flip-flop of opening, and for somebody who is perhaps looking to have a bit of secure employment, the uncertainties of being able to guarantee those working hours or retain those individuals were, difficult, and we ended up having to struggle to find that workforce, and a huge loss. I think the workforce shrunk from about 225,000 employees to about 185 now, so about 40,000 in total.
I want to turn to asking you now about some of the financial support measures that were put in place to mitigate some of the impacts you've described for us there. in terms of the funding received by your member organisations, can you give us an overview of the various support schemes that were available?
Well, we as an organisation were very fortunate to have received monies redirected from Visit Scotland's budget, a sum of £80,000 to enable us to undertake the work that we did on behalf of the sector, I think recognising as well the role that we played, but also being appreciative of the fact that many of our members wouldn't be able to pay their subscriptions and things. So that money went towards basically subsidising the subscriptions of those members who were due to pay, and it enabled us to carry on functioning. I'm aware that other monies were also allocated out to some of the key sectoral bodies as well, not all, but importantly those who could support and assist, and again similar to the Scottish Tourism Alliance, exposed by the timing of the impact. Over and above that, of course, the other funds that became available through the finance industry, so the Seabills Fund and the bounce back loans, which were hugely welcomed. I had, through our role within the COVID business group, established some very close relationships with the colleagues in the finance industry, the main leaders of the banks in particular, and where there was a business, for example, who may not have been initially sort of approved as a business for a particular loan, they would contact me, and I was able to then maybe provide some reassurance and some, I guess, a bit of support to the banking community to say, could you go and revisit that application? They are a good operator, etc. So that was one way, and then of course we had the other grant mechanisms that were put into play, the pivotal funds, and I can't remember the name of the other one. And obviously they were administered through the enterprise agencies and the local authorities, and the rates relief was the other critical one that was needed too.
Thank you. Towards the bottom of page 7 of your Rule 8 response, you say the qualification criteria set for this financial support could have been better, and I think you then go on to say there was a lack of appreciation that accommodation businesses in a local authority perhaps that was not under lockdown still relied on clients from other local authorities that were.
Yeah, so this was a bit of a dilemma, that in the lockdown areas it was assumed that obviously those businesses, because they're locked down, they wouldn't actually be able to trade, and for argument's sake, the cities, many of the rural businesses in Perthshire and further afield, their customer base were due to come from the cities. So, but as they weren't in a lockdown area, they didn't receive any targeted relief at that particular time. But of course, they had no trade because their customers were actually locked up in the city. So there was a bit of a mismatch there in terms of how those allocations of funds were made. There's no, don't get me wrong, I think that those in the cities were also very appreciative of it, or urban areas or unlocked areas. So trying to find that balance was important. And again, I don't think there was a full appreciation of that supply chain, those needs to be able to support businesses, to be able to get them into those areas which weren't locked. So the qualification criteria was hard, and I wouldn't take anything away from anyone. I think we were all having to pivot into a different way of working and actually trying to find some sort of fix that was you were able to make function properly. There were, of course, decisions taken south of the border in how monies were allocated into which parts of the sector and other industries that didn't always replicate in the same way through into Scotland. And we had some which actually, and you referred to the tour operator group earlier, for example. Our colleagues south of the border in that type of community, they received no support, whereas actually there was a fund allocation through the conversations that we were able to have with the Scottish Government and the ministers that led to the funding going into that particular community in Scotland, which was very welcomed. And you'll hear from Fiona Campbell later about the initial deviation around support for the self-catering community and the bed and breakfast community in Scotland to England, which obviously needed a lot of work and a lot of effort, which was led by Fiona primarily, to actually get a turnaround on that, to ensure that, you know, the majority of that sector got support where possible. There were also, you know, a number of other, you know, our industry is very, very diverse, and so a lot of sole traders who, again, because of the type of business that they were a sole trader operator, tour guides, etc. Some of them relatively new, didn't qualify for that, and there were, of course, you know, many businesses or many people operating in the industry who didn't have a home to go to. So the Scottish Wedding Industry Alliance, so that sector didn't have a trade or representative body, and yet there are, you know, venues, dressmakers, a huge industry as well, that eventually, you know, coalesced and came, and we helped them establish that group and for them to come around our council, Scottish Agritourism being another group as well, which allowed that sort of evidence base of this is an industry here. So trying to ensure that no one fell through the gap, but unfortunately, you know, there were businesses that did fall through a gap, and ultimately we've lost them. And I think you heard from Colin Borland at the Federation of Small Businesses that the business failure was huge, and many of those businesses would have been some of the small independent operators in different parts of the sector that would have not been able to survive.
Did you see your membership grow? You've mentioned there the wedding industry. Did you see it grow during the pandemic?
Yes, it was. We were, I think, very much because of our efforts, and we were, you know, I was wanting to make sure that we were there for everyone. We weren't exclusive just to members of the STA, quite the opposite. We were accessible. Our communications were being extremely well received and understood. So, you know, dog kennels and catteries, you wouldn't necessarily associate them as being a tourism business, but of course, if nobody was travelling and going away, they had no clients, no cats and dogs, and therefore were as exposed. And so we had dog kennels and catteries become members, and, you know, a broader church of others. So from we've got a number of colleges and universities there, but particularly groups who, you know, school travel, tour operators, etc., who hadn't necessarily been members before, but felt because of our ability to gather that insight, have the year and regular engagement with government, feeding that into Sturg, I guess gave them some hope that their voices would be heard, and we, you know, and find, I guess, companionship as well amongst that group of businesses. It wasn't a very it was a difficult time. The mental health of the industry was extremely challenging, and there were some very, very tough moments, as everybody experienced, and hard going. But I guess there was a view for some. If you tuck in behind an organisation that seems to have coalesced well and come together well, then that might have given some comfort, if not the right outcomes of relief as well.
Thank you. In terms of the level of support, you say in your Rule 8 response at the foot of page 6, the level of support and relief varied, and you've set that out for us, but you say for some it was insufficient to meet their basic fixed overheads.
Yeah, I mean, my chairman at the time was very public with his personal situation, you know, a family-run business, 5th generation Crieff Hydro family of hotels. I mean, the business was shut down to its bare minimum of what they could do. You've got, you know, insurance requirements. You've got, you know, a limited amount. I mean, every single radiator was switched off. You name it. His daily overhead was £25,000 a day. So, and it's a family business. So he, I think, lost £25,000 a day for 240 odd days of COVID. Mentally very tough to take, but also obviously the grant support, when you sort of look at that, £150,000, whatever it was, I can't remember the exact numbers, was minimal. Nobody would expect anybody to be able to put that millions of pounds into the business to protect it. So it was a borrowing piece, but it's all proportionate. You know, it's not just that large business. There's a minimal overhead. So not going to take away any sort of view that, you know, whatever money was given was extremely welcomed, but for a lot of the sector it wasn't enough, and outlays had been made by businesses to try and put in place the best possible protection methods, the screens and fogging machines and all of this stuff. So there was an investment made by the business to try and ready themselves to make money. And but the relief that was there was just, welcomed, but certainly not enough to compensate for the losses as well.
Thank you. I want to ask you a bit about the delivery of these support measures. How quickly was it acknowledged by the Scottish Government that the impacts were such there would need to be measures?
I think, in fairness, there was a degree of reality. I mean, obviously what was flowing through from decisions being taken south of the border, and you would hope that that four-way Cobra conversation was taking place, reliefs and everything were being recognised as being needed. It varied in terms of the dispersal of the reliefs by local authority. Obviously the registers and things, there were businesses there that possibly weren't even on the register, and there were people applying in thinking they were on the register. So there were certain authorities that were exceptionally quick and very good, and businesses who had an ability to apply, and I think that's the other thing we have to, the learnings from this is that many of our sector were not necessarily technology enabled in terms of skills around being able to apply online and do all of those applications. The mental stress was huge. So the accuracies around the submissions and the claims being able to were not always as good as some better than others. And that resulted in the flow of the reliefs coming through. It varied from time to time, but could it have been quicker? Of course, you would always want it to be quicker. You would want it to be instantaneous. And I think those triggers for futures. God forbid we end up in a similar situation. You would hope technology will allow that to happen straight away. And we it's uncovered all sorts of ways of working in the sector that, like, you would have thought that they were processes and etc. were in place already, and systems talk to one another, but that's proved not to be the case all the time.
Thank you. In terms of the delivery of support, excuse me, you say at the foot of page 6, the time it took to deliver support varied by local authority. I want to just explore with you, just briefly, what was it that caused this difference? Was it the volume of applications received, or different different application of the eligibility criteria?
I think it was a combination of things. As I was referring to earlier, the actual submission piece maybe not all may not have always been as accurate as it could have been. The understanding of how to submit, I think, in local authorities themselves, they were obviously having to pivot their own employees into doing jobs and roles that were new, not necessarily familiar with. So, nobody's going to take that away. Everybody had to adapt. So it wasn't one specific thing. It was a mixture of, and it's typical in life that it's always the same people that end up being at the back of the queue for whatever reason. But saying that, we had at least a means to be able to refer through to individuals in local authorities of where those perhaps sticking points were in applications. So Business Gateway was represented on the STIR group, and when we convened, and having that ability to be able to make direct reference to examples of where people had identified to us that they were still waiting or there was a blockage was useful, and it picked up a bit. But it's like anything, you would have wanted it to be spontaneous, and the knife edge that so many of these businesses were on was so finite. It was it was desperation at the end of the day.
In terms of STA's role in advocating for the industry and shaping this through their interactions with STIRG, were you able to raise this with the government and try to influence that?
Yes, I mean, the Minister access was extremely good. I mean, as I've referred to at the outset of STIRG, Fergus Ewing was an exceptional minister in his direct role with us, and there were plenty of communications, lots of phone calls, the availability to have that input with him, Ivan McKee followed into the role after as well. The Scottish Government Civil Service tourism team were, accessible as best as they could be. And again, I think, there was so much coming. There were only so many hours in a day, and obviously, people needed to have some downtime. So there would have been frustrations where you didn't necessarily get the response on the timely basis that you might want it to be. And from a personal point of view, I was probably working around 18 hours a day for 7 days a week for however many weeks that went into, because I felt a duty to do so. I wanted to do so. And when somebody's speaking to you at 8 o'clock at night, you might want to try and get them a response at 8:30. It doesn't always happen. But the access to ministers and government was good, and we obviously had the other forums on a day-to-day basis where we were meeting, so you could put that into the conversation and the minutes of those meetings too.
Thank you. I want to turn now to asking you about the guidance that was published by the government. Once it was published, how was this guidance communicated to your organisation?
So the guidance, again, the communication platforms were challenging at times, because there was not always that central point and go to, and not everybody accessed online information and got where it wasn't a way of working that was something that we were used to. So when the guidance was published, it was uploaded onto the Scottish Government COVID website. Visit Scotland hosted the guidance, then took the guidance onto their website. The one thing that we didn't do is, when we, as a business and an industry as a whole, is to try and rewrite guidance or represent it. We signposted to the guidance as soon as it came out through our communications. The guidance was often published at the very end of the week as well, and that was a real challenge for business, because it had to go through its legal process, and particularly where, as and when the sector was open in parts, if there'd been any change to the guidance, then the impact of that would be effectively from almost that weekend. So making those adjustments was really, really tight for some businesses, specifically the wedding industry. It was one example, because you're dealing with a community of people that you might actually have to turn around suddenly and say, sorry, what we've all agreed and what you've hoped for is now not going to happen, or there are certain things that you could do and couldn't do, but the communication of that guidance and how it flowed out, again, we pushed it out to our networks, and that was then cascaded on, and as the deeper we got into COVID, again, that sort of way of working and familiarity with guidance coming, on a particular day of the week, and we were warming people up to say, watch out for it, watch out for it. But the day of the week it often landed was probably not the best day. But when is a best day? I suppose that's the other question that would rightly be challenged.
Thank you. In terms of the dissemination to your members and then onwards from them to the sector at large, did that, for STA, did that involve summarising the information?
We try not to break it down into too much detail. There was headline bullets. We had again, our communication. We had our own branding almost that sat above each communication, so people knew what to expect. But through the dialogue with the industry, colleagues through the week, inputting into the guidance of what it might look like was also a part of that work process. So what might work, what might not work. So there was certainly consultation had with key colleagues to say, would this work, wouldn't it work? We didn't necessarily always get the right outcomes, or there were at times differing things. So the summary of that, I guess, of what might be coming down the track would have been had in a communication or a headline. Again, the colleagues' individual headlines tended to go back to that core document. Some of it at times was a bit clunky and deep, so there was a need to maybe signal some key points, but people were attuned to things. How they interpreted it may not have always been consistent. That's the only thing.
Okay. You've mentioned already some of the costs associated with implementing the guidance. I think you mentioned PPE and screens, and you mentioned also that there was a lack of understanding of the costs associated with closing and with reopening. That's about halfway down at page 7 of your Relate response. You speak about that lack of understanding, and you say the phrase again, the flip-flop of lockdowns.
Yeah, so perishables, for example, food, obviously being the obvious one. If you're trying to open a restaurant and you're trading, you've got product that has got short shelf life, and every time you try and bring a property up to a temperature as well. We were in the spring. I don't think it was a particularly warm time as well in the early parts. You've got to get your property to a place where it's comfortable, and that all comes at a cost every time you switch something on, switch off. But in particular, the food and drink perishables were the ones that were the most costly, and the bigger you are, obviously the more upfront investment you've made into that product. So large hotels, etc., you couldn't necessarily save everything and freeze it down or whatever. So, and people wanted to keep their actual their overhead and operating overheads to a minimum. So, and I don't think that was again appreciated of just how much that cost was at the time, and it certainly wasn't compensated for in terms of the reliefs that were made. If that closure happened, it was another element that sort of hit you into your balance sheet.
In terms of sticking with the guidance, I want to ask you about the logic of some of the guidance as you set it out at page 5 of your response. You say here there were some very questionable pieces of guidance that industry colleagues, members of STA, especially those in hospitality and wedding sector, struggled to comprehend as to what logic was behind them. And you say such as the defining of a cafe and stating that a Scotch egg was a main meal. Can you expand a bit for us on the illogicality and on those particular examples you've given there?
Yes, so there was some various bits of decisions on the types of premises that would be able to trade and at what time, so particularly around the service of alcohol and the definition of a cafe was again not necessarily decided on by somebody within our industry, but that then resulted in seeing some businesses trying to redefine themselves as a cafe, which obviously came with cost and change and questioning. The Scotch egg, again, I think this was this is all back to the relationship with alcohol being able to be ordered and drunk, because the guidance said, well, as long as you have a main course meal, then you are able to order wine or have something with your meal sat down. And somebody announced that a Scotch egg qualified as a main course meal, which again was sort of paying lip service to an industry. Didn't ask the experts. I mean, I'm sure, and I know for a fact that many establishments were delighted that a Scotch egg was actually classified as a main course meal, particularly south of the border. And I don't think it was a Scottish government minister that decided a Scotch egg was a main course meal, but it came through. And there were those sort of, questionable things as to confusion north and south of the border as well on some of the decisions that were taken. How does that translate? We have many of our visitors, when they did come, they came from south of the border and they were coming into Scotland where there were slightly different regulations in play. And the cafe definition was fine. I seem to remember there was one with retail as well. We ended up having furniture stores actually putting in fridges into their shop and selling milk, so they could stay open and be qualified as a grocery store that was obviously essential services or essential. I can't remember the exact definition. So, but this conversation didn't happen with the industry, and I think that was the frustration, and again caused unnecessary furore amongst the colleagues as well.
Were you able to make that conversation happen through your engagement with the government on groups like STIRG?
We had several engagements with Jason Leach and a number of his other medical colleagues as well through fora that allowed. I mean, I think Jason attended our council meeting on a couple of occasions as well, and obviously those communications or views and opinions were able to be fed back to him and other colleagues in the Scottish Government civil service.
Thank you. You've alluded just a moment ago to the differences between Scotland and the rest of the UK. Were there substantial differences in the guidance in Scotland compared with the other UK nations?
There were varying differences. Again, a lot of it related to the ability to enjoy food and drink together in different settings. Mask wearing was another one. I think coming up on the railways or on the buses when you got to the border, you had to put your mask on. You were coming into Scotland, and I guess from the traveller behaviour, they were going and experiencing things of how you had to behave if you were, or conduct yourself if you were in a property south of the border, to how you chose to do what was expected of you in Scotland, and bookings, reservations, movement around particular properties, and the way in which you had to conduct yourself. So it became challenging for a number of businesses, and how do you communicate that? I think that interpretation as well, because the guidance south of the border was often released, I think, the day before or 2 days before or whatever was coming out, and then by the time the Scottish version then came into play, maybe that was 24 hours later, and then of course the colleagues in Wales actually then experienced a further amendment, and more often than not, you'd have a business that would actually, grasp the guidance, and because the communication that was being relayed, you thought, okay, this is for us, and then all of a sudden you think, hang on a minute, no, that's not for us. But the interpretation of the consumer didn't necessarily look across the four nations and accept that there was a different approach to different things.
Thank you. And you mentioned at page 7 of your response that this at times caused confusion, and you mentioned the timings and the terminology also. That.
Yes, we had again. It's quite hard going back to all of this, to be honest with you. But you had the zones. I think the different categorisation of areas, lockdown areas, from recollection. They were referred to in different the tier 1, tier 2 groups, and I think there was a different terminology used south of the border. So what might that mean in terms of the differentiation between what you can and can't do in those particular areas? And I guess tourism is it's a global industry. People move around, and people were hoping, many people wanted to come to Scotland, obviously at that time, for the outdoor side of it and the space and getting out of the cities. So, but that whole interpretation and differentiation in terms of language was I think something that I would personally recommend and say that there shouldn't be deviation. And the Four Nations approach, as we always were sort of led to believe, was where it started. You often felt come the end of the week there was perhaps not the Four Nations approach that was originally intended, and there was deviation, maybe for good reason and maybe for not so good reasons, differing times.
Thank you. I want to ask you a bit now about ongoing impacts in terms of the ongoing impacts from arising from the government's response to the pandemic. Are there any ongoing impacts?
It's brutal. The harsh reality of it, I mean, many would say, in the industry would say, actually what we're faced with now is more challenging times than we had through COVID from a business perspective, largely down to workforce losses, and not having that support, the recovery time for a lot of those businesses, because that pipeline of recovery hadn't been built up, and I guess we were slower than others. We advocated a lot for the importance of making sure Scotland had a strong presence globally and internationally through its marketing activity, but these businesses had literally come back to a point where they were so rock bottom. Many of them have borrowed money. They've not been able to invest in the way that they want to keep their properties to a standard or a competitive level, and the workforce impacts have been severe. We've seen, despite incredible response from the international audience this summer, you've got businesses out there that can't trade 7 days a week. They've lost a lot of skill set in certain parts, so therefore their offering is compromised. Yeah, there have been breaks in the supply chain, so there's been a need to readjust, and that is the harsh reality of it. We're not out of the woodwork yet, and unfortunately the UK is an extremely expensive destination now to do business in. We might be appealing, but to make money, turnover's up, but profit has gone backwards year on year, and largely that's due to not just COVID. It's a combination of Brexit, war in Ukraine, and everything else. But there is no support this time round, which is why I say it's tougher for many than COVID was during that, because there was support there at least.
I wanted to ask you there just what you've picked up there, that it is perhaps attributable to things other than the pandemic response. Is the position of STA that it is in whole or in part attributable to the pandemic response, or are there other factors?
Yes, we do say, and we often, in our commentary to government, and when we're making representation, we do reference that the current climate is tougher than COVID. Obviously, extremely grateful for the way in which colleagues, in Visit Scotland and the enterprise agencies work with us through COVID, and they all had to do different roles, but that getting back to doing business in the way in which we wanted to do business, and I refer back to 2019 as a country and as an industry, we were in a very, very good place, but I think we're in a position now where we're behind the curve compared to some of our competitors, and they're better placed to probably advance more rapidly and grow the tourism economy back. We've got more. I mean, I think the latest stats, there are more people flying around the world today than there were pre-COVID, and many would have thought, well, actually that would possibly be a lot less. So the airline industry is back. But we don't have as many businesses, we don't have as much product, and there is the ability to be able to meet that demand as and when it comes is much more challenging in a profitable sense as well.
Thank you. In terms of STA's current role, or even its potential role in addressing these ongoing impacts and the priorities that you've mentioned there, how do you see that?
Well, our dialogue with government is extremely positive and healthy. I don't say we always get the right outcomes. The industry leadership group was re-established as a separate entity, and we are all working towards the ambition that is set out in the strategy that we launched on the 5th of March 2020. It's still very relevant, and the advocacy role of the STA is to continue to lobby and try and influence the right conditions for success that talks about right policy, the right implementation of that policy, the right investment into infrastructure, into skills, into marketing, and into connectivity. Those are the key areas, there is an alignment with the destinations around the country. That all feeds into the national strategy for economic transformation. So, our role is, I still say we're a critical part of the fabric of the economy, and we are a stronger organisation, I think, in many ways. And actually, our relationships with other business organisations has never been better, because that period of COVID where we came together, there is a better understanding, a much more collaborative way of working, but we still don't have, I suppose, nirvana when it comes to being absolutely the best possible way. But the aspiration is to get a lot better, but we're coming from this, a challenging place, particularly around labour, workforce. It's and obviously some impacts that have now recently been felt with fiscal measures and things that have been announced through both the UK government and the Scottish government.
In terms of that tourism strategy that was launched in March 2020, is that still in play?
Yes, it's here. It's we can't believe we're nearly halfway through. So Yes, it's in play. The aspiration is there. I think we might struggle to be the world leader in 21st century tourism, but we want to be a world leader. As we head towards 2030, of course, we have to reevaluate and what that future strategy beyond. And the world has changed. The way people choose to travel, the way people, what they experience, what they want to do. There's much more, I think, demand and expectation of wanting to do things, bucket lists and experiences rather than collect stuff. So businesses have had to, again, adapt and pivot into a different type of operation and present, new opportunities. So there's a big education piece required, and I say that restoring the industry workforce to a place where we can meet that demand, but also making sure that the industry is actually seen as one that you can be confident of, that it's not going to get closed down or shut down and will be treated with the level of importance that it deserves, is also critical too. And I think we've come through the worst of it, but we're on a difficult ride, and what that future strategy looks like beyond 2030 will have a whole heap of other considerations to be taken into account.
Thank you. I just want to ask you in closing whether you have any suggestions for the Scottish Government in terms of how they might seek to address and mitigate some of the ongoing impacts arising from their pandemic response.
Yeah, I mean, I think the first and foremost is continue to take the point and the point from us and learn that the industry tourism does not just happen. There are multiple of levers that are required to make it the economic driver and the force for good that tourism can be. And, we see the sector as one that can contribute significantly to the well-being of the nation. So they need to, not look at it through a narrow lens, but actually really appreciate the broader impacts that tourism has in every economy, and that's rural and urban, and the narrowing of the lens is dangerous, so immerse themselves in a much broader conversation with the industry going forward, and continue to do so. Don't stop.
Thank you. And in terms of anything that the government could have done differently or to improve matters should there be another pandemic or a similar emergency?
Well, I think we have to obviously, this part of this process is to build on the learnings that have been taken from here, and I refer to Sturg as an entity. It was something that worked through foot and mouth. So there was a bit of a best practice model there that was stood up, and it worked again to a point. I wouldn't say it was perfect, but actually, as long as that learning is taken into account, and organisations such as the STA, the Retail Consortium, are valued for what the contributions that we can make, and that's together with our subgroups of the association trade bodies, respect the voice, and the timing of information is critical. And I think our data and our insights, and this is not just about the COVID time, the flow of that information has to be as literally so much more timely and evidence-based from the outset. Before decisions are taken, and I think that's a key part to get things better and not have to flip-flop, close down, open up, etc. But a lot of learnings to be taken, and do not in any way discount the mental health and the impacts, because it's been quite a learning journey, and not those of us who sit in certain roles, we're not counsellors, but my God, certainly you want to be there for people, so you need to support that part of the industry or society more generally. Where is that mental health support? And I don't think that was there of sufficient scale to really recognise how important that was.
Thank you very much, Mr. Crowthall. I have no further questions, my lord, unless you have anything to add or ask.
No, thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Crowthall. Sorry. Right, we'll take a break now and come back at 11:45.
Thank you.
Good morning, my lord.
Good morning, Mr. Turner. Now, you have a witness for me?
I do indeed, my lord. The next witness is Mrs. Fiona Campbell from the Association of Scotland's Self-Caterers.
Good morning, Mrs. Campbell.
Good morning, my lord.
Right, you're going to be asked some questions by Mr. Turner. Can you please start when you're ready, Mr. Turner?
Thank you, my lord. Good morning, Mrs. Campbell.
Good morning.
Before I begin, Mrs. Campbell, I'd just like to remind you that this morning and this afternoon's hearing will be transcribed. If you could try and speak slowly and clearly, that will help the stenographers. I will try to do the same, and then neither of us will get into any trouble. First of all, could you state your full name, please?
Yes, apologies in advance. I have a spot of laryngitis, so I'll do my best. My name is Fiona Campbell, and I'm the Chief Executive of the Association of Scotland Self-Caterers.
Thank you. And how long have you held that position?
It will be 10 years come February 2025.
Thank you. Since 2015 then?
Indeed, yeah.
Thank you. And the association has provided a response to a Rule 8 request from the inquiry, is that correct?
Indeed it is.
And, my lord, for the record, that is reference SCI ASSC XX 27. Mrs. Campbell, this morning we're going to talk about a number of things that you've raised in that Rule 8 response. We may not have time this morning and this afternoon to discuss all of that response, but please rest assured that everything in that response, and indeed all the other documents that you have provided, will be taken into account in the inquiry, even if not touched upon this morning. In a moment, I'm going to ask you some questions about the association, but before I do that, I would like to talk a little about the self-catering sector more generally. First of all, could you explain to His Lordship what's actually meant in this context by a self-caterer?
Indeed, it's one of those definitions or phrases that's different wherever you are in the world. So it might be vacation rental if you're in America, but you would know it as a holiday home. So one would go and stay and cater for yourself rather than staying in a bed and breakfast or a hotel.
Thank you. And are you able to assist His Lordship in terms of how large that sector is in Scotland?
Well, interestingly, we have not had any definitive data on that until recently when the Scottish Government brought in the licensing scheme, and it transpires that there are approximately 18,000 self-catering businesses / properties in Scotland.
Thank you. And in terms of financial numbers, Mrs. Campbell, are you able to say how much that's worth to the economy?
Indeed. In fact, we've just actually commissioned a report from Bigger Economics, and they estimate that the sector is worth £877 million to the Scottish economy.
Thank you. And how many people are employed in that sector?
Approximately 29,000.
Thank you. If I could turn back to the association itself, when was the association formed?
The association was formed back in 1978, so that we are the second oldest association representing this sector in the world, only pipped by the post by a year by the Danish.
By the Danish. And what exactly is the association?
The association is made up of 1,700 members who represent either one unit or up to many hundreds of units if there is an agency, for example. It's a membership organisation, not for profit. We represent businesses from small cottages on an island to wonderful apartments in a city centre and castle. So it's a broad church of operators.
Thank you. And you mentioned there that you've got members and you talked about operators and agencies. Are there different kinds of members then that the association has?
There are indeed. Essentially, a member is somebody that either operates one business or an agency that represents many businesses or properties. We also have partners, so trade suppliers and people that work within the industry, for example, insurance brokers and financial lenders that all represent and support the sector, the wider sector, and tech solutions and that wider ecosystem that drives our sector.
Thank you. And are you able to tell us anything about your operating members? For example, how long those tend to have been operating?
Indeed, that's very interesting. Just to put it into context, the majority of our membership, so 70% of our members are, beg your pardon, 60% of properties are rural or on islands. 70% of our membership are operated by women. 60% of those are operated by women over 55 years of age.
Thank you.
And the vast majority of them have been operating for over 10 years.
And in terms of where these businesses sit within members' lives, are you able to offer any insight into the importance of the income from these properties to those members?
I think, yes, if you reflect on that demographic, that 70% are women and 60% are over 55, it's quite clear that our sector enables certainly women to have an excellent income stream whilst also doing what they need to do in terms of caring for whether it's parents or children. So it's a flexible way of earning.
When you say it's a flexible way of earning, does that mean that some members have other sources of income, or do members tend to have this as their only source of income?
Some absolutely, it's their sole income, absolutely, but also it can be part of a wider network of income.
And are you able to offer any? You may not be able to, but are you able to offer any insight into sort of how important it is in terms of whether it's a primary source of income for these people or whether it's a secondary source?
Well, it's interesting because that comes back to what we'll be discussing later, I'm sure. There was an eligibility criteria around whether it was a 1/3 or more or a primary source of income. And for many it wasn't, because there are a lot of people in our sector where it is very much part of a live income stream.
Thank you. You mentioned that there's quite a big variety of organisations in terms of the numbers of properties that we are talking about, and you mentioned, I think, people who just have one property who might be members, through to agencies that represent many. Do you know who the largest member that you have?
Am I allowed to mention the name of a business?
Sorry, poor question, Mrs. Campbell. What is the largest number of properties that somebody has? Do you know
The largest number of properties that one operator has individually is 53.
Thank you.
Beg your pardon. But 55% of our membership only operates one property. So frequently, for example, myself, I've been an operator for 22 years. That's how I got into the business. It is the large property, and we live in the stables at the back. So that is quite a standard sort of operating process, whereby it's on your land and it's part of your part of your life and your business, and you live next door.
Thank you. We're here obviously this morning to talk about the COVID-19 pandemic. And I'd like to talk to you now about the impact of that on self-caterers. Are you able to tell us when, in terms of the timeline of the pandemic, when self-caterers were first affected by what would become the COVID-19 pandemic?
Obviously, you heard from Mark Rothwell of the STA earlier today, and we were very much aware that something was coming fast down the tracks from around the 5th of March onwards. We instructed the sector to close down on the 22nd, so that's the day before the Prime Minister shut down the country on the 23rd of March.
And indeed, I understand that that was a request made on the 22nd of March, is that correct?
Indeed, yeah.
So in fact, the industry closed down effectively before lockdown even occurred?
We felt that that was the responsible thing to do under the circumstances, so that is absolutely what we encouraged, yeah.
In respect of that lockdown, or that shutdown I should say initially, was there any consultation or notice given by government in respect of that closure?
Only that which is in the public realm. So no, there was no, I didn't get a letter to say, tell everyone to shut down, for example.
In terms of that announcement that will be made on the 22nd, for example, had there been prior notice at any time, any date prior to that might be coming down the line?
No, not that I recall.
So we've got shut down on the 22nd of March. Are you able to assist His Lordship as to when self-caterers were allowed to reopen?
Indeed, the tourism industry generally was allowed to reopen on the 15th of July, but the ASSC lobbied very hard on behalf of the sector, and we actually were able to open on the 3rd on the basis of the evidence that we provided that the sector was actually safer than most accommodation settings and hospitality settings, and on the basis that we had created some very stringent cleaning protocols, which were then actually adopted by the 4 UK nations and others, with the support of Professor Linda Bald. So we were able to open on the 3rd of July, which represented £20 million to the Scottish economy.
Thank you. You've mentioned there cleaning. During the periods that self-caterers were open, did they face any other measures in response to the pandemic, other than closure?
I think what's important to recognise about our sector is that we were not able to diversify in the way that many others in the tourism and hospitality sector were. So, for example, a restaurant could diversify and offer takeaway and home delivery boxes and so on and so forth. However, our sector was just shut. You couldn't diversify. Now, we did welcome in October, I think it was October the 30th, and again on as a result of the lobbying of the ASSC, we got confirmation that self-caterers could indeed welcome multiple households for key workers, which was a huge win for the sector, and made an awful lot of sense in order to keep the country running. But other than that, our businesses were closed.
Thank you. If I could come now to talk about some financial support that was available or not available during the piece. You've spoken there a moment ago about the initial closure that took place on the 22nd of March. Was any financial support made available for that initial closure?
No. Regrettably, at the outset, we were excluded from any grant support, despite the fact that our UK colleagues were given grant support immediately, in line with everybody else in terms of the non-domestic rated businesses. I worked very closely with Kate Forbes, who was the minister in charge at the time, and we were delighted that on the evidence that we produced that we were viable and important businesses that represent such an important part to the Scottish economy, that decision was reversed, thankfully, by the end of March. Unfortunately, compared to other small businesses that were just all treated the same, we had a very stringent eligibility criteria that we had to meet, which was that we had to be we had to be actually operating for over 140 days a year, and it had to be a primary source of income. Primary being slightly subjective. That phrase also changed eventually to significant, but unfortunately, again, that's quite a subjective phrase. So it then became 1/3 or more of income. And going back to the conversation that we've just had, whereby self-catering is quite often very much part of a very important diversified income stream, that became quite difficult to manage and was directly different to our UK comrades.
If I could just unpack some of that. So initially you had criteria that provided for 140 days and a primary source of income. What was the association's reaction to that? Did you do anything when you heard that?
Quite a lot, yeah. We worked absolutely tirelessly to represent the small legitimate businesses across Scotland. So if you're, for example, in Shetland, you're going to be quite a seasonal business. You might not be able to meet the 140 days. So the immediate thing that we did in the association is we started our surveys, and we started doing weekly surveys of the impact of those decisions and that eligibility criteria. And we worked incredibly hard with Ms Forbes and also Fergus Ewing and other officials in the Scottish Government to try and reverse the decision, or at least change the decision. Because there was a lack of parity across other businesses in Scotland, but also self-catering businesses across the UK. You said you did surveys and gained that empirical information. What did you do with that information? We created weekly surveys, created weekly reports. We fed those reports into the Scottish Tourism Alliance Council, the STIRG meetings, Scottish Government officials, ministers, opposition MSPs. Anybody and everybody that would listen was getting empirical data thrown at them thick and fast, because it was necessary, because our sector is made up of very small individuals in large parts that have very small voices. So we became that voice very quickly.
Do you feel that you're providing that information, do you feel that that was new information to government?
I do believe so, yes. I don't believe that prior to the pandemic they understood what our sector really looked like.
Thank you. And you've mentioned in consequence of that there were changes made to the funding arrangements.
Indeed, and we welcomed those changes, and we welcomed the fact that they did listen to the evidence, and we were able to create other grant schemes that they didn't have in the rest of the UK, for example. So there were very much positives that came out of those surveys and being able to provide that empirical data.
Thank you. You obviously provided that information proactively. Do you feel there's anything that government should have been doing itself?
I think that consultation prior to making decisions would have been helpful, and consultations prior to laying some of the legislation and guidance would have been helpful, certainly. And also having the data in place to understand the sector, because I think not just our sector, but for example, Wild Scotland and South Scotland, they had difficulties accessing support as well, because the Scottish Government didn't necessarily understand those sectors.
You've mentioned the input there and frankly the education that you were giving in terms of the design of schemes. Did the association have any involvement in the implementation of any of the funding schemes?
We did indeed. Once we'd established that we were eligible for the small business grants, we then worked with the Scottish Government and Visit Scotland to develop an additional ended up being £1.5 million scheme to reach some of those businesses that didn't meet the eligibility criteria. For example, say that business on Shetland. So it couldn't necessarily meet the 140 days. But it was certainly a primary source of income. So alongside colleagues at Visit Scotland, we had 750 applicants and we were able to help 250 businesses, which was fantastic. And then after that, there were other schemes that I helped to create for the sector. So that was the largest 7+ self-catering grant, and also the grant for self-catering businesses and bed and breakfasts that were not on non-domestic rates, of which there are many.
Thank you. You mentioned there 7+, which I think is referred to in your Relate Response is the Large Self-Catering and Exclusive Use Grant. Is that
Indeed.
correct?
Yeah.
Could you explain to His Lordship, first of all, what the issue was in respect of why that grant was necessary and why that difficulty had arisen?
Indeed. It comes back to the concept that the larger self-catering businesses, you obviously cannot diversify unless you've got key workers being accommodated. But if you look at the larger self-catering businesses and you look at the, I will use Mark Crothall's phrase, flip-flop of opening and closing and levels, larger self-catering businesses could not operate uninterrupted until December 2021. So by December 2021, they'd only been operating uninterrupted for 28 out of 90 weeks. Otherwise, they were closed. So therefore, whilst a one-bedroom, two-bedroom, possibly three-bedroom property was able to operate, the larger properties weren't. So that's why that 7+ grant was incredibly welcome.
And what was the reason why those properties couldn't open as opposed to some of the smaller properties?
It was the rule of 6 and the households and the levels and, yeah.
Could you explain what you mean by the rule of 6?
It got to September of 2020 and the introduction of the rule of 6, which was you could have 6 people from 2 households in level 3, level 2, can't remember. Level 0, you could have 8 people from 3 households in a property. Level 1, you could have 6 people from 2 households. And when you get up to level 2, there was no indoor gathering at all. So if you've got a large self-catering property, say 5 bedrooms, 6 bedrooms, you were shut.
Shut because they had to close, or shut because they couldn't get bookings, or?
The likelihood of you getting a booking for one household in a 5-bedroom property is fairly small. So therefore, larger self-catering properties rely on multiple groups of people, whether it's multi-generational or groups of friends or family coming together. That's what that is our market, is bringing people together to have a wonderful experience and a wonderful holiday, which again goes back to the kind of mental health benefits of our sector. That became impossible. And you're not going to open a large property for 2 people because it's financially not viable.
Thank you. In your Relate response, Mrs. Campbell, I counted, I think, 7 different schemes that were created specifically for the self-catering industry. That seems quite a lot of schemes for what is one industry. Do you think there's a reason why they were required to have lots of different schemes as opposed to addressing matters?
It's a very good question. I think it stems from the fact that the original scheme didn't go far enough, and we evidenced that it didn't go far enough. Therefore, they had to keep creating new ones to address that inconsistency and lack of parity. And we absolutely welcomed it, but it also showed a lack of understanding of the sector. So the fact that a lot of our members are not necessarily on non-domestic rates. Now that's perfectly reasonable and legitimate, but that is a fact, and therefore they were not eligible for any grant scheme. I worked very closely with the Scottish Bed and Breakfast Association because bed and breakfasts are not consistently on non-domestic rates at all, and they were getting no help at all. So I worked very closely with them to make sure that they were also supported.
Thank you. And it may be implicit from some of your earlier answers, but to your knowledge, was there any planning in place for the industry for a situation like this?
Absolutely none.
You mentioned a lack of parity on a number of occasions. Just to be clear, what was the distinction between what was offered north and south of the border?
South of the border were automatically enabled to apply for a grant, as were any other small business in England. They got exactly the same grant support as the rest of the industry. In Scotland, as I've said, you know, we had to have a very strict eligibility criteria. And then if you had more than one property, say you've got 2 properties, in England, you would get £10,000 per property. In Scotland, you got £10,000 for the first property and £7,500 thereafter. And there seemed to be no rhyme or reason for that.
You've mentioned that difference across the border. You've mentioned the levels that we obviously all experienced during the pandemic. Did that cause any distinctions within Scotland in terms of operators?
Indeed, if you were in a level 0, whereby you could mix, but you are largely reliant on people who are coming from the central belt, for example, Edinburgh, Glasgow, and many people are, because they come from Glasgow and go out to the countryside, especially during the pandemic, wanting to get into that fresh air. They couldn't travel, therefore you didn't have guests, and yet you were in level 0, therefore you didn't get any grant support. So you were closed down on the basis that you didn't have any guests. So that was very difficult.
So in effect, you could operate under the rules, but you couldn't operate because you didn't have any customers, effectively.
Indeed, indeed.
Thank you. We've spoken about financial support for your members. Was there any financial support available for the association itself?
There was, and we were incredibly grateful for it. We were offered a market readiness fund in February of 2021 to the tune of £50,000. And then there was a sector marketing fund in June of 2021 of £62,000, which enabled us to reopen and help our members to reopen. So there was we did some marketing campaigns to encourage guests back to the sector and so on and so forth. So that was incredibly welcome.
I'd like to now come on to talk, if we may, about guidance ultimately that was offered to the sector. But before I do that, you've noted in your response a number of times that you were contacting public authorities, to the Scottish Government in particular. How did you find, or how was that contact? Was that easy, or did you have lines of communication that were readily available to you?
At the outset of the crisis, we were told that all communication should go via the Scottish Tourism Alliance. And whilst we understood that under the circumstances would be a sensible option, and we tried to do that as much as possible, the fact that our sector was being quite so challenged, shall we say, in terms of sectoral support, we found it necessary to go out with those channels and contact officials and ministers directly. It got to the point where that was absolutely understood, and we had open lines of communication. Sometimes that was challenging, sometimes that was frustrating, but the channels were open.
And how was your input received?
Mostly positively.
I'd like to speak to you now about, I suppose, information coming out of government in terms of guidance and others. How did the association find, or indeed how did its members find the information that was coming out of government at the time?
It was hugely challenging and hugely frustrating at times, and I'll echo what Mark Crothall said earlier in his evidence session. Frequently, guidance would come out at 5:30 on a Friday afternoon. That guidance was landed with no consultation and no insight that it was coming, and we would then have to unpick that. So you'd spend the weekend, and like Mark said, we were on 16 to 18 hours a day, 7 days a week, for months and months and months, trying to make sure that we gave the best guidance to our members. Now, the guidance would come out frequently, which would not be in plain English, and it was largely unintelligible for the end user. Our sector is made up of largely small independent operators that don't have a legal team behind them, were desperately keen to do the best thing and to do the best thing to protect the safety and the health of the nation and to save their businesses and their mental health. And the guidance was not clear. So we would then have to wait until Monday, go back to the Scottish Government officials and ask for clarification on the guidance and the legislation. At which point we did end up having a system whereby we would give them frequently asked questions, they would then answer the questions, we would then be able to distribute that to the sector. But by that stage, you're 3 days in, which felt like a lifetime under the circumstances. So it would perhaps have been easier if they had consulted with sector and industry before they released that information and in a more timely manner so that we weren't scrabbling around trying to understand what we had to do, what our compliance requirements were at that time on a Friday afternoon.
Can you explain, and you may not be able to, Mrs Campbell, but from your experience of dealing with the Scottish Government, can you explain why information was coming out in a confused way?
I think this is uncharted territory. Everyone was doing their best. I totally appreciate that. It was difficult circumstances everywhere. Certainly when it came to levels, the Scottish Government was making decisions on a Tuesday that would be implemented on a Friday. Nobody knew what was going on. It was stop-start, spitfire, knee-jerk. It was just difficult to decipher. Now, everybody was working under incredibly difficult circumstances, and we all have to reflect on that, and hindsight's a wonderful thing. But it was very, very difficult for sector leads and indeed operators to navigate through that guidance.
You've spoken in relation to the funding situation about a lack of knowledge or understanding of the industry. Do you feel that had any bearing on the guidance that was being issued at the time?
100%, absolutely. As I say, it goes back to the levels and the rules of households. So again, if you look at guidance that came out on the 22nd of September from the Scottish Government saying that self-catering hospitality venues could accommodate more than one household. And then on the 23rd, Professor Jason Leach came out on the radio to say that that did not include self-catering businesses. And on the 23rd evening, the Scottish Government officials confirmed that it did include self-catering. We didn't know what was going on. And then by the 27th, the guidance had changed. So it became quite difficult to ascertain whether it was medical advice, whether it was legislative advice, whether it was guidance. It just became very, very confused. And for people, you know, small operators that were desperately trying to do their best, but also having to communicate with their guests whether they could come on Friday or not, or whether they were going to have to ask their guests to leave on the Saturday that had arrived on the Friday. It was very, very difficult indeed to navigate.
You've mentioned a moment ago different advice coming from different areas, from the medical professionals to the politicians, etc. One of the things which the Scottish Government announced during the pandemic, and indeed which His Lordship will ultimately be looking at, was the question of the four harms in terms of the balance between health, economy, social issues and the like. Do you feel that had any bearing upon decisions that were being taken?
I'm sure it absolutely did, but I'm not sure that they were seen holistically. And that's the important thing. So when it comes to, again, a self-catering holiday, it's really important. People hadn't seen one another, especially when it came to that first Christmas. People needed to see one another. We'd set up cleaning protocols, that there was evidence that there was no transfer of COVID in the self-catering premises in Scotland. We are incredibly proud of that as a sector. And yet we were still largely, you know, closed down in large parts. So that the economic impact was vast, but also that social piece was, I think, slightly lacking. I think that those four harms needed to be seen slightly more cohesively.
Thank you. You've told His Lordship about the input that you had, obviously trying to resolve some of the confusions in terms of the guidance that were issued. You've also spoken about your, I suppose, direct contribution in terms of guidance, in terms of cleaning protocols. I wonder if you could tell us how that came about.
That came about by working with my colleague down in England, who runs the Professional Association of Self-Coaches. So I represent Scotland, he represents England and Wales. And collaboratively, we decided that it would be a really sensible thing to do, to offer guidance for people. As I say, our sector is incredibly responsible, wanted to do the best thing, wanted to make sure that we were absolutely fit and ready to open as early as we could. So we decided to start writing it. So I sat at my kitchen desk for 8 weeks writing cleaning protocols, and I know more about cleaning than I ever wanted to know. But it was worthwhile, and it was great. So it was a proactive approach to try and mitigate against some of the impacts and help our sector to reopen again in the best possible way.
Is that something that you knew about before you sat at your kitchen table and started to write the cleaning protocols?
No. I mean, I'll hoover, but no.
So you effectively were starting from scratch in terms of that approach? Yeah,
I now know an awful lot about chemicals and all sorts of things. But it was actually very, very important to know, and actually it has increased best practice going forwards, because it's actually, you won't want to know this, but easier to get rid of coronavirus than it is to get rid of norovirus. So all of those cleaning protocols should really have been in place anyway. So actually it's just created best practice that I think we should all be proud of.
Were the cleaning protocols in place beforehand then?
Not technical ones, no. Not official ones, not like there are now.
And those official ones, just to be clear, those official ones are the ones from your kitchen table?
Yes, they are. With help from others, clearly.
Just to be clear, though, that help from others, that was coming from those other professional organisations that you mentioned that you were working with collaboratively? Professional
organisations, and also they were approved by Public Health Scotland as well.
And just in terms of that approval, was that you taking them to Public Health Scotland, or were they involved in the design of them in the first place?
No, we took them to Public Health Scotland and said, are you happy with this? But we also work with all sorts of organisations across, internationally, to make sure that those protocols were absolutely robust. And they were then adopted by all sorts of online platforms and, as I say, internationally. So it was very much a collective effort.
Thank you. You've talked there obviously about working collaboratively with organisations. Is that something that the association does ordinarily, and indeed is that something that the organisation did more generally in the pandemic?
It has always done so. We are very much a collegiate organisation working with other organisations and destination organisations and so on and so forth. We've always had a very close relationship with the Scottish Tourism Alliance and others, and also our colleagues across Europe and currently internationally. Have always done that, but that obviously became much more important during the pandemic. So whilst we obviously fed into the Scottish Tourism Alliance Council and the Scottish Tourism Emergency Response Group and Visit Scotland, I also worked very, very closely with Scottish Agritourism and Sail Scotland and Wild Scotland, because we largely represent small businesses. So we very much came together as a smaller group of support. And actually, I think one thing that I would like to raise is the impact on sector leads, whether that was Mark Rothall or the sector leads of agritourism and Sail Scotland, Wild Scotland, etc. It was hugely challenging, and there was a huge mental strain on us as sector leads representing the thousands of businesses that we represented. So we came together really closely to support one another. So there were definitely tears on calls at times, for sure.
And has that had any legacy in terms of those relationships and working practices?
Very much so. Some of my best friends are sector leads now.
I'd like to talk to you now about, you've touched upon some of this when we've been speaking, but I'd like to talk specifically, if I may, about the support and information that you provided to your members. First of all, could I ask, how many members did you have before the pandemic?
632.
And by the end of the pandemic, how many members did you have?
1,600.
And are you able to, I suppose, hypothesise, because we can't look in people's minds, but can you hypothesise as to why that increase happened?
I think that we provided the support that they needed. Whilst the Scottish Government would issue guidance on their website, as I say, it was not plain in English and it wasn't sectorally defined or targeted. So they looked to us to give them the guidance that they needed and the practical help and the support and advice. So not only did we do the cleaning protocols, but we were doing all sorts of online webinars in terms of what people needed to do, how they could get grant support. I was on a weekly call with the Scottish agritourism sector to let them know how they could access grant support and so on and so forth. So we became somewhat indispensable. Between March and October 2020, we issued 240 pieces of guidance via newsletters. So we were actively giving people the information they needed, sometimes up to 3-4 times a day.
You've spoken of us, that's a huge amount of interaction with your members. Just to be clear, what size of organisation is the association in terms of staff
At that
operating?
point, it was 3 members of staff, including me.
So 3 members of staff are issuing 240 news pieces, etc., and webinars and all of that.
We were tired. But we felt an absolute responsibility to do that, and it was a pleasure to do that.
Mrs. Campbell, looking to the future and coming out of the pandemic, did the association have any involvement in terms of steps that were taken towards recovery?
Indeed, we fed into a large number of the groups and the panels and the Benny Griggs reports and so on and so forth to try and ensure that we came out of it and recovered and there was resilience. I think that many of our members would still say that we're in survival mode rather than recovery mode.
Which I suppose brings me to my direct question. I mean, what is the current position in terms of the sector? Are you able to say what the current dynamic looks like?
Well, regrettably, whilst large swathes of the community came out of the sector and tried to recover and get on, we launched straight into the Scottish Government's introduction of short-term let licensing and planning regulations. And as a sector, that has been significantly more challenging than COVID. We have now seen the sector shrink by at least 4% across the whole of Scotland. That increases to 22% in Edinburgh, 27% in East Lothian, etc. So we are facing unprecedented challenges, and it's not just recovery of COVID, but it's the cumulative impact of other regulations put on our sector.
Thank you. Mrs. Campbell, that's the end of my specific questions that I was going to ask you. In a moment, I'm going to give you the opportunity, if there's anything else that you feel you particularly want to raise with His Lordship, that will be your opportunity to do that. Before I give you that opportunity, just to remind you, we obviously have a number of documents that you've kindly provided to the inquiry. I've read all of those, and His Lordship will have an opportunity to do so in due course. But if there is anything that you would particularly like to tell His Lordship, whether we've discussed it or not, that you'd like to highlight, now's your opportunity.
Thank you. I think what's important is looking forwards and taking the learnings from a hugely challenging time worldwide and actually actioning those learnings and understanding the deficiencies that were there before the pandemic, the learnings that were created during the pandemic, and best practice going forward. And I think that best practice largely looks like working and consulting with industry when it comes to introducing legislation, understanding industries before legislation is implemented, and reflecting on the importance of different industries and sectors to the Scottish economy.
Thank you, Mrs Campbell. My Lord, that's all the questions that I have, unless your Lordship has anything additional that you wish to ask.
No, I've got nothing to ask, just to thank Mrs Campbell for that very informative and helpful evidence. I'm very grateful. Thank you very much. And I do hope your voice recovers.
Many thanks.
Right, we'll take lunch now. 1:45.
Thank you, my Lord.